Hey there, fellow netizens. This is Kevin in the editor's chair with a bit of housekeeping before we start this episode. First off, we're only going to be running one episode this month, which will be our conclusion of our series looking at the man who sued the video game industry over Columbine, the colorful character that is John DeCamp. Also, the other part of that is, after this episode, we're going to be pivoting into what I'm hoping will be a tradition, at least going back to last year, what we call Scandalous Games Summer, where we'll be taking a couple of months off, where we won't be doing as detailed episodes, and instead doing a couple of syncable audio commentary tracks. Past recordings we've done have included Uwe Boll's 2003 adaptation of The House of the Dead, as well as the 2005 adaptation of the movie Doom. And for last year's Scandalous Games Summer, we covered the, in my opinion, campy cult classic, the 1994 adaptation of Street Fighter, starring Jean-Claude Van Damme and the late great Raul Julia. We also did the 2020 adaptation of Monster Hunter by longtime video game movie director Paul W.S. Anderson. Next month, we will be starting the summer off with a look at the 1989 classic / 100-odd minute Nintendo commercial, The Wizard. And I hope you all check out of that. It should be a lot of fun. And I hope you'll tune in to see what the next audio commentary track will be after that. So, hope you all have fun. We'll be back in the fall with some more fun, interesting looks at video game history through the lens of controversies. And with that, the thrilling conclusion to our look at John DeCamp.
How about them Huskers? Ooh-ah. Hello, fellow netizens, and welcome to Scandalous Games, the show where we take a closer look at video game-related controversies. I'm Kevin Impellizeri, and I do the research and share a story of a video game-related controversy to my friends.
I'm Andy Hunter, a longtime fan of all things Nintendo.
I'm Kate. I've been writing software for over 10 years, but not the fun kind.
And it's so great to see all of you. Good to see you again, Andy. How you been doing?
Been doing okay. As I was just telling you before we started recording, been playing Super Mario Wonder. That game is a delight. Would recommend to any Switch owner. And find bits of joy where you can, including in video games.
Isn't that a summary for 2025 if there ever was one? I was video game newbie Philip Thomas not joining us for this installment of our look back at John DeCamp, the man who was behind the $5 billion lawsuit against the video games industry after Columbine. I thought of making a joke, and I talked about this off recording. I thought about making a joke about him setting to a black site because we got too close to the truth, but it's a little too real these days and a little too close to home, so I'm not going to make that joke. So please clap for my restraint.
You're a hero, Kevin.
Yeah, armed police showing up at the IMLS last week was not something that I think any of us would have predicted. But
Christ almighty. I just try to keep moving forward at this point. Jesus Christ. If I don't laugh, all I can do is weep. So we are continuing our look at this guy, John DeCamp. And for those of you who might have missed our last episode, and a recap also for Andy joining us for the second half of this. So as I mentioned before, John DeCamp he's a Nebraska lawyer who was behind the huge lawsuit against the games industry after Columbine, alleging that video games had played some sort of role in the shooting, either training the shooters to be able to hone their accuracy or psychologically conditioning them to be able to kill with impunity. And DeCamp is as we learn, a really fascinating figure. He had been a longtime Nebraska lawmaker. He had served 4 terms in the Nebraska legislature as a senator. During one of his re-election campaigns in 1984, he had come under fire under allegations of child sexual abuse, ones that ended up not revealing any evidence. As far as you know, there's no basis in any fact on this. He eventually is ousted from his seat, and he's a lobbyist for a little bit. He resurfaces in 1989 in the midst of a scandal over a local community credit union in Omaha, which had been shut down due to massive financial crimes on the part of its executive director. But all of a sudden, there came out all these allegations that allegedly it was basically like what QAnon would say is going on right now, where it's basically these big parties of wealthy and politically powerful elites who were basically involved in this massive child abuse ring. DeCamp comes in alleging that he has this list of names of people who are at the heart heart of it, there's a massive investigation in Nebraska that ultimately comes up with nothing, eventually leading to a grand jury that basically said it was basically a politically motivated witch hunt, that the whole thing was a hoax concocted by people who had really intimate knowledge of Nebraska politics, and that one of those people may have been John DeCamp, allegedly in an attempt to gain revenge for what had happened to him in 1984, as well as to possibly fuel a political campaign, as well as to help a person in the Nebraska legislature who he was connected with as a lawyer. But he seemed to maintain that this was a real thing, despite about 2 years of investigations finding nothing except some very wild, not necessarily very reliable, and in some cases ethically compromising testimony, which we talked about last time. But in 1992, he publishes a book called The Franklin Cover-Up, in which he alleged not just that this thing was really happening, but that it was also a massive satanic cult with people doing, blood sacrifices and, killing and eating babies and all this wild stuff that was in there. And that's basically where we left things with John. He's gone from, I guess, respected lawmaker to conspiracy theorist, conspiracy monger.
Yeah, everybody's out here filling up on babies instead of being law-abiding citizens.
Yeah. Especially in Nebraska. I don't know what food is good in Nebraska. I imagine probably things
Corn.
Corn, yeah.
Lots of
Yeah,
corn.
it's the corn. Yeah, the University of Nebraska Cornhuskers.
The
I think
Huskers,
is
yeah.
the football team. When I listened to the last episode, I initially was on board with this guy. My dad's from Nebraska, but then, other than being from Nebraska, I then didn't really care for most of John DeCamp's choices. So that's where I stand on him so far.
That's an interesting place to start from, because now this is where our baseline is. And I'm going to tell you in advance, it doesn't get any less weird as we go forward. But I promise, because this is ostensibly a video game podcast, that we are actually going to talk about something related to video games. And we're going to get to that lawsuit. But for that, we got to trudge through some really fascinating stuff here. So going beyond the Franklin cover-up, child abuse, Satanism, and murder in Nebraska, it turns out that when you accuse your former coworkers of engaging in satanic blood sacrifice rituals while raping little kids, they're less inclined to work with you anymore. And DeCamp quickly found himself a pariah in Nebraska politics.
I'm sorry to interrupt again, but I was thinking about this the other day. I imagine it's like in the the Purge universe, like the Purge horror movies, where it's like if you try to kill your coworker during the Purge, which could happen, it's not outside the realm of possibility. If that doesn't happen, or if you don't get there before the bell rings or something, that's going to be a very awkward year waiting for the next Purge to roll around. And I kind of imagine it's slightly similar here.
Yeah, I can imagine a scenario in which John DeCamp is he writes this book where he's been accusing all of these people he's worth. It's a good game. You wanna hit the Arby's and decompress a little bit? I think once you do that, you kind of reach a point of no return, It's really hard to come back from that. And yeah, so he found himself a pariah in Nebraska politics. His lobbying firm, which he claimed at one point brought in about $400,000 a year, quickly collapsed, and he found himself increasingly reliant on his legal practice to stay afloat. But before you go feeling bad for poor old John DeCamp, you'll be happy to know he quickly got back on his feet in the 90s by acting as a legal counsel, defending the people society forgot, the little guys, the underdogs, violent right-wing militias.
Well, I mean, I guess everybody deserves a lawyer, but if only his lobbying firm were making more money, he probably, I'm sure he didn't want to defend those violent right-wing militias, right? It's just that he needed the money from somewhere.
Got to pay those bills, But so we need to step back for a second. I think before we go any further, I'd be remiss if I didn't offer a little bit of context about this. So, what do you all know about the American militia movement?
So I would almost guess that it's maybe not even a single movement, or at least what I'd always assumed was that there is a bunch of different militias or would-be militias in the U.S. with different goals. I mean, presumably all of them share a distrust in the U.S. government, or just are maybe wishing to be prepared in case of some unspecified future event. I'm sure a lot of them really are quite attached to that ambiguous language in the Second Amendment that goes, a well-armed militia. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know about specific goals of any of the various militias in the U.S.
It's my understanding that, they refer to paramilitary private organizations or groups of people who might refer to themselves as militia or consider themselves to be militia organized or otherwise. They may or may not see themselves as legally recognized organizations. And I think there's a lot to do with the sovereign citizens movement within the American militia movement. That's about all I know.
All right, these are good overviews. I'm not going to do a huge amount of detail on this because, again, this is technically a video game podcast, so I'm gonna give you kind of some broad strokes. So, the American militia movement, also known as the Patriot Movement, refers to a wave of organized right-wing paramilitary groups that emerged beginning in roughly late 1993 and peaked around 1996. These various grassroots militias were generally unified by two overarching political philosophies, which you basically covered, Andy. Those are a deep mistrust of the federal government and an ardent defense of Americans' right to bear arms. They are also generally ultra-nationalists, viewing themselves as the quote-unquote real Americans, fighting against tyranny and calling themselves militias as a callback to local civilian military groups during the American Revolution. As a little aside, I used to work at a Revolutionary War-focused museum, and one thing that they talked about was that militias were some of the least reliable segments of the American Revolutionary War effort, but that's neither here nor there. However, what actually constituted tyranny among these people varied depending on the group. For some, it was taxation. For others, it was gun control. For still others, it was legalizing abortion. For still others, it was giving rights to anyone who wasn't a white Christian dude. However, the movement acted as a big tent for all sorts of right-wing culture war talking points that'd be right at home on the likes of Fox News or in the gaping orange maw of America's current president. As a result, it shouldn't come as a shock that more than a few also espoused anti-Semitic, nativist, ultra-Christian, and or white supremacist beliefs, while also not being opposed to resorting to violence to achieve their goals. The movement was also a fertile breeding ground for various conspiracies, which, take your pick. Secret cabals, the Rothschild Foundation, water fluoridation as mind control, false flag operations, and what all else your racist uncle on Facebook or Republican politician is on about this week. And we're not going to go into a huge amount of detail on the Patriot movement, but ideologically speaking, these kinds of groups have had a long history in the United States. And the militia movement's predecessors include earlier ultra-nationalist terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, militant anti-communist and or fascist organizations like the John Birch Society and the American Nazi Party, and extreme anti-government movements like the Posse Comitatus. However, the movement sprung up in the early 1990s due to a variety of factors, such as violent clashes with federal officers, namely the 1992 Ruby Ridge, Idaho standoff, and the 1993 federal siege at the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. Other historical forces driving the movement include the 1992 election of Democrat President Bill Clinton and the passage of what the militia people viewed as overreaching federal laws, like the 1993 Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, the assault weapons ban included in the 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, and the 1994 North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. These and other factors led some right-wing folks to believe that the federal government was growing out of control and that real patriots needed to organize and fight back by force if necessary, with some even calling for the violent overthrow of the government. Public awareness of the Patriot movement peaked in the aftermath of the April 19, 1995 terrorist bombing of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. The bombing, which involved a truck rigged with improvised explosives made from fertilizer and other household materials, killed 168 people, including 19 children, and wounded hundreds of others in what was then the worst terrorist attack on U.S. soil in American history. The mastermind was Timothy McVeigh, with help from his co-conspirators Terry Nichols and Michael Fortier. McVeigh wasn't a member of any specific militia, although he was an ex-KKK member who had been in contact with some homegrown extremist groups, including a militia called the Wolverine Watchmen, who were in the news a few years ago because they staged a failed kidnapping of Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer in 2020. However, even if he wasn't a card-carrying member of a Patriot Front group, McVeigh was all in on a ton of their ideology and was willing to carry out those beliefs through terrorism. The movement fractured after the Oklahoma City bombing, thanks in part to increased law enforcement attention, as well as infighting in the movement. Incidentally, more than a few of these supposed anti-government types also started flipping on each other and turning informant to the feds when the heat got on. However, depressingly, it never truly went away, eventually achieving a resurgence in the 2000s thanks to events like 9/11, the 2008 financial crisis, and the presidential elections of Barack Obama and Donald Trump. And modern successors to the 90s militia movement include the Three Percenters, the Oath Keepers, the Boogaloo, and the Proud Boys. Thus ends our little overview of the history of the militia movement. Going back to DeCamp, the disgraced former Nebraska politician turned satanic pedophile cult investigator worked with several militia groups and affiliates throughout the 1990s. In 1995, he became legal representative for the Militia of Montana, one of the earliest high-profile militia groups, who allegedly hired him after reading his book. In 1996, he represented Yuri Kull and Scott Full, a pair who fatally shot two U.S. Marshals on February the 13th, 1983, when they were trying to arrest Yuri's dad, Gordon, who was a member of the paramilitary group the Posse Comitatus, for a parole violation. Now, going back to what you said before, Andy, what I said about that he started defending these folks. Now, let me be clear. Everyone is entitled to qualified legal representation if the need arises. And just because an attorney signs on his counsel for an individual or group does not mean said attorney ascribes to their client's ideas. In fact, DeCamp downplayed his involvement with his militarized clients, joking during a May 25th, 1995 U.S. Senate hearing on domestic terrorism, quote, 5 months ago I couldn't spell militia, and now I represent one, end quote.
Proud author John DeCamp. I don't know how to spell words.
I want them to be on the back of the book. I couldn't spell militia. So yeah. Anyway, here's how John DeCamp bought into his client's ideas. It should come as no shock that the guy who put out a whole ass book claiming that basically the entire Republican establishment was involved in a nationwide devil-worshipping child sex abuse ring was a bit predisposed toward conspiracy-minded thinking. For example, during Kull and Full's trial, DeCamp told a reporter for the Bismarck, North Dakota Tribune for a March the 3rd, 1996 article that he was certain he could reverse their convictions because he had uncovered a vast conspiracy involving both the government and the Freemasons.
Remind me about the Freemasons again. What do they?
I'm not going to
What do they have
bother.
to do with? No, seriously. What do they have to do with this?
Because they're like conspiracy-minded people like frame them as like an Illuminati type organization where they're like behind all this stuff, like all this stuff about like Masonic conspiracies. Like the movie National Treasure is built on the idea that like the Masons are like influencing the world behind the scenes.
I'm just curious if the folks who are name checking the Freemasons actually like explain to me what the Freemasons do. What that is. Go ahead, tell me.
They run the world. That's why they're up front in the public and they have, big temples where you can go into and, just operating right in plain sight, the bastards.
Whenever I hear people talking about conspiracies, I'm reminded of something that a college professor that I had once said. He was a history professor. I had him in a course that was nominally about the history of purported UFO sightings in 20th century in the US. But the entire second half of the class was about hypnosis sessions he had conducted under people who believed themselves to be abductees, and he himself was a believer and everything like that. So this is someone that you might think would be predisposed to conspiracy theories, a la like the Fox Mulders of the world. But he never believed in any conspiracies. When questioned like, "Oh, do you think like the government is covering this up or something?" He's like, "No." Because here's the thing. An enormous conspiracy would require, so many people all doing their jobs perfectly, never accidentally or deliberately spilling the beans. When has that ever happened? That you have, 1,000 people all working perfectly, never screwing anything up, never getting fed up and leaking something to an employer. Even top secret government stuff gets leaked from time to time. So
Sometimes a journalist gets added to the group chat. Whoopsies.
Yeah,
timely joke.
Well, if there is a government conspiracy quieting, the existence of extraterrestrials or anything, I guess, over the next 4 years, that is when we'll be finding it out because
this is the end of any sort of organized ability to contain any of that.
Yeah, but so anyway, I doubt I will, with that little speech, I will convince anyone who is currently a conspiracy theorist, but anytime I'm even tempted to think that there might be a conspiracy, I remember that point by that professor and oh yeah, sometimes if you think there's not news of something because of a giant conspiracy, maybe in fact there's not news of it simply because there's not that thing in the first place.
Yeah, it's just it's kind of a similar thing with a lot of true crime, honestly. When people think oh my gosh, this person vanished without a trace and what happened? Did this happen? Did that happen? It's in all likelihood, you kind of know what happened. You know how life goes and what the circumstances actually indicate. But when people really get wrapped up in a conspiracy and this is what they really want to believe, you're not going to convince them with some objective factual information like this.
Yeah, I came across this study. I want to say George Mason University did, but don't quote me on that. But I came across this study.
George. Freemason University?
Oh, see?
But they describe conspiracy theories as self-sealing. That no matter what you tell to a person, whatever you say will reinforce the belief system. They will kind of morph around it. But you got me thinking, Andy, because I've been researching a bit on the Satanic Panic for potential future episode. I came across this really fascinating book from the late 1980s. It was one of the people who was a police investigator who was trying to debunk the whole idea, this whole idea of a vast satanic network operating in the country. It didn't happen for the exact reasons you described. Because basically it's like they would presuppose that it's a massive, elaborate, multi-person, multifaceted, multi-departmental, people in the government, people in the media, all these other people operating, like thousands of people who are operating in secret, who never break rank, who never talk, and never leave a single trace wherever they're at. So they're engaging in these massive blood sacrifice rituals, but you would never see any. There's no bones. There's no evidence of anything. Again, clearly they are so loyal to each other that everyone's gonna stick together, which is never happened in human history. Never. So yeah, going back to DeCamp. DeCamp is convinced that, he's got this vast amount of information that he's sitting on that this is going to break this case up, that it involves the government and the Freemasons. And in fact, it is worth mentioning that DeCamp developed a reputation of allegedly having vast collections of damning evidence that would break the lid on various wild conspiracies, none of which he ever presented to the public because he claimed it was all tied up in litigation and or the powers that be would have him killed if he revealed it. On top of all that, in 1996, he put out a whole new edition of the Franklin cover-up, chock full of a whole bunch of new conspiracies involving secret murders, even more satanic rituals, and even government mind control projects. So there's a person we mentioned last time. You remember this case, this guy Paul Bonacci, who was one of the witnesses in the Franklin sex abuse scandal. And I mentioned the fact that Paul Bonacci, according to DeCamp, exhibited multiple personalities. I think he said something like 8 different personalities. According to DeCamp, Bonacci got those personalities because he was, in addition to being part of this vast child sex abuse ring, he was also part of a secret government mind control program. A very, very busy young man.
All right, so let me back up. Is the suggestion that he developed dissociative identity disorder through the trauma of being a part of this program? Or is it so we're kind of using different terminology here when we're saying he got all these, quote unquote, all these personalities. Is DeCamp indicating that he's collecting personalities like Pokemon cards?
I'm picturing a Manchurian candidate type of accusation that he's saying this government mind control program is such that they give him his code words and then he switches personalities to be whatever the government wants it to be.
Oh, so it's not that he was horribly traumatized and therefore developed this...
It's kind of both. It's kind of that he was in this government mind control program that fractured his psyche. That basically it was a Manchurian candidate type control thing, but it's also again, this is not based in any fact.
No, I understand. I'm just trying to figure out what the claim is. The claim is that this was an attempt at government-based mind control that resulted in dissociative identity disorder.
Yes, it's like an offshoot of that. They weren't trying to do that, but that's what happened.
Okay, and they were trying to use... I'm unclear. I don't remember I remember we talked about this last time, but I don't remember if it was clear that this person had actually been diagnosed by a medical professional or if this was an allegation. Not that it would be a bad thing if he did, but do we know if this person had a publicly available diagnosis or?
I don't think so.
Okay.
The thing is, it's extremely...
was this an allegation intended to discredit him?
No, this was an allegation that basically DeCamp was saying that he is using these personalities to talk about the alleged sexual trauma he went through the Franklin Credit Union scandal. He is suggesting that it's like a repressed memory, kind of a Michelle remembers kind of thing, that this is the way he is manifesting the trauma that allegedly happened for that, and that this is the way he's able to talk about it. I don't know if he ever got a true diagnosis, because the only accounts I've heard from this guy are within John DeCamp's, sphere. And Bonacci is, again, extremely difficult to research because so much of the things that I find online are linked to this alleged conspiracy theory. So DeCamp is saying that basically that these alleged personalities are manifestations of a repressed memory of this alleged trauma that happened. But he's also saying that this guy was also part of a secret government program that fractured his psyche too.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a tangled knot, this whole thing.
Just that tactic of, I've got information. I will share it one day, maybe when I'm able. This really reminds me of Q from the QAnon type stuff. And I know people have tons of theories about who Q is, but Maybe we should add John DeCamp's name to the list because he's still using the same tactics.
John
There's-
Q. DeCamp.
There's truly nothing new under the sun. Like, the internet just gave a new way of conveying that same kinds of information. It's old wine in new bottles, is the old saying. It's a different
Well,
package.
that whole I know something really big and juicy, but I can't tell you,
Yeah.
but maybe one day if you do enough things my way, line yourself up enough my way, like, okay, here we go, conspiracy theory wise. Isn't that kind of within the Church of Scientology that there are the letters that only the highest elders in the church are allowed to read that supposedly reveal like the truth of the universe?
I think so.
Yeah.
Like, it's for the idea
Watch
of
Going Clear.
the idea of holding on to like privileged information and things like that. And so DeCamp is doing that in this situation. So
And sort of dangling it like a carrot, like pay attention
Yeah.
to me and legitimize what I'm saying because believe me, I know
Yeah.
what I'm talking about.
I'm the only one who knows what I'm talking about. Like, I have all this vast information. So he had vast information on this alleged, satanic sex abuse ring. Now he has all this extra information on these two militia guys.
A guy with all this kind of information, he should really be careful. Somebody might like try to hurt him or something.
So yeah, he's holding on to this information. And so again, this is all in his new edition of the Franklin cover-up. I've seen this book. It is basically doubled in length now from what it originally was with this whole new edition of all this extra stuff. And one of the new sets of red threads he had added to the corkboard that was his mind involved getting to the bottom of who really blew up the Murrah Federal Building. And John quickly found himself an Oklahoma City bombing truther. He's collecting conspiracies like Pokemon, to go back to your reference, Gate. As an aside, it became a popular narrative in the militia crowd that the bombing was a false flag operation perpetuated by the U.S. government and a nefarious plot to discredit them. So this is a common thing that's coming out of the militia movement, too. That's basically, this bombing couldn't have been us. It had to be the government basically setting us up. The Timothy McVeigh was basically a patsy. And for an example of DeCamp getting in on this kind of bandwagon, in 1995, John DeCamp represented Hoppy Heidelberg, a former juror in McVeigh's trial, who got kicked off after he told a right-wing newspaper the government was covering up the identity of a second bomber, which is another common talking point in the militia movement, that there was someone else there. And to help him find the real culprits, John partnered with a former FBI official turned private investigator named Ted Gunderson. And I'll let a 2001 article from the Southern Poverty Law Center give you a sense of DeCamp's latest professional partner. Quote, after 27 years in the FBI, including stints running the Memphis, Dallas, and Los Angeles offices, Ted L. Gunderson embarked on a tour of the weird. Retiring in 1979, Gunderson started a security investigations firm and eventually wound up as an investigator in the ill-starred McMartin preschool sexual molestation case, where he became fixated on the idea that children are regularly subjected to satanic ritual abuse. In the end, 7 years of trials produced no convictions, and the case was widely denounced as a destructive witch hunt. From there, it got truly strange. Entering the Patriot world as a leading conspiracy monger, Gunderson made videos alleging an invisible cabal called the Illuminati had plans to run the world. He sold his services shielding people from electrostatic sensory manipulation and testing for brain implants, tracking chips, and resonant cavities. He claimed a government official told him he did the Oklahoma City bombing, saying, "That's my bomb." He said a cure for Down syndrome is being kept from the public and that the government practices mind control and that his children had DNA extracted by aliens at the infamous Area 51 of UFO fame, end quote. So what do we think of this guy?
Wow. Yeah, he really yeah, it makes you wonder, like, is he a true believer, so ready to believe just anything? Or is he just so desperate to be listened to that he's willing to say whatever people want to hear?
Yeah, like is he just like courting controversy and saying all kinds of wild things that people can't help but respond to? Throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks, sort of thing?
I can't help but think what he would have been like as an internet content creator. Because isn't that the rub so much with people who delve in these circles, and like either he's extremely gullible and extremely suggestible and just believes or he's manipulating this as a way of seeking attention.
And they're also not mutually exclusive.
That is true. That is true. He might just be extremely incurious, or again, conspiracies are self-sealing. He might have found people who will help validate what he believes, or it's also possible that he's engaging in these circles that are helping to further conspiracy pill themselves. He believes in this one thing. He meets a guy in the militia crowd that believes in this other thing, and they begin to kind of like their things start to meld and like metastasize together. It's very possible that all of those things are true. All right, so Ted Gunderson. With that kind of rational, discerning mind, John was on the case. Not only did he devote a whole chapter to the new edition of his book speculating on a second bomber, why the feds wanted the building demolished so suspiciously quickly, and various other musings of the jet fuel can't melt steel beams variety, he even mailed a copy of the Franklin cover-up to Timothy McVeigh himself, who at the time was a resident of the federal supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, with a letter asking for his side of the story. He even autographed his book with a personalized message to McVeigh, writing on the inside cover, quote, "To Tim McVeigh, it's all true to the best of my knowledge," end quote.
That went right into the prison library donation bin and then hopefully not into the general collection.
I actually found this through a really interesting blog called My Oklahoma Obsession, which a person came across this specific book with the autograph.
How'd they find it?
I'll bring it up real fast.
Yeah, because I'm just like, I was kind of joking about the donation bin thing. Like, did McVeigh keep it? Was it donated to the library? Was it thrown out? Did you find it at a Goodwill somewhere? Like, what happened?
So this person, I'm rereading this thing again. This is from, again, My Oklahoma Obsession. This person found it on Amazon, of all places, for $12 for a used copy.
And I'm sorry, this is the physical copy you just referred to with the inscription. Okay,
and
all right.
the reason they know that, and they show a picture of this, it has the inscription I just said. It is stamped from the maximum security prison in Colorado.
So it probably was circulated out of there. Like it was probably, went into the library probably.
I'm sharing on the screen the picture that they shared of it. So here it is. There's the Franklin cover-up inside cover. And you can see below it a stamp that says Administrative Maximum, Florence, Colorado. This item was received through the mailroom/R&D and is the personal property of inmate. The name says McVeigh.
And they got this on Amazon, this book.
Yeah. That's like me getting that signed copy of Jack Thompson's book.
I mean, but I've gotten used books online, and yes, through Amazon, that were clearly like they were a library was selling off old stuff, right? Like where it was like property of the whatever library, So I guess the same thing makes sense. And it's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe after he died, they got rid of his things and.
Yeah, maybe. Because if I'm reading the stamp correctly, clearly someone at the prison examined this book and approved it because there's an approval signature and a date of August the 27th, 1998. So clearly this was brought to the prison and sent through. It seems legitimate to me, which is just wild that this dude, messaged a guy who at the time was the perpetrator of the largest domestic terrorist attack in U.S. history. And this guy this is going to connect to videos. Eventually, this guy sued the video game industry.
I'm assuming that McVeigh never responded to his inquiry for his side of the story.
There was a letter by DeCamp to McVeigh. There's no evidence of any letter back from McVeigh to DeCamp.
Oh, no, you've done your research on DeCamp. I feel like if Timothy McVeigh sent him so much as a birthday card, this guy would have lost his shit and written another book.
Yeah. Hold on to because he does eventually put out another edition of this book, but you make a very good observation. He makes no mention of McVeigh getting back to him. So that tells me he probably never wrote him back. So yeah, the plot thickens on this guy. In addition to spending the 90s associated with some very fine people, DeCamp was also desperate to reclaim the political power he once held before he started tilting at windmills full of satanic cabals, and through the 1990s and early 2000s, he staged several failed election campaigns. For example, he unsuccessfully ran for governor of Nebraska in 1994, 2 years after he published that whole wild conspiracy book. In 1996, he was accidentally nominated the Libertarian candidate for U.S. Senate in Nebraska. And the way that happened was another candidate got the nomination by the Libertarian Party. And apparently by Nebraska rules, a person can't run from two parties. So they dropped that guy and they went to the next closest person in the vote count for the Libertarians, which was John DeCamp, who got 6 write-in votes. But he got taken off the ballot after a court challenge. So he was basically nominated for U.S. Senate by accident.
Yeah, I feel like Spider-Man gets more votes than that per year.
Mickey Mouse probably outvoted him in the Libertarian Party, After that, he ran for lieutenant governor in 1998. When that didn't work out, he ran for U.S. Senate again, this time on purpose in 2000. And when that also failed, he tried to get back into the state legislature in 2002, only for him to get kicked off the ballot for not residing in the district in which he wanted to run. And as an aside, you kind of alluded to this before, Kate, this dude really stayed in the public eye a lot for a guy who claimed to be keeping a low profile out of fear the feds were going to assassinate him for all the privileged information he allegedly collected over the years. Isn't that funny? And John DeCamp also started setting his sights on video games. I promise we would get to that. In 2000, during his failed U.S. Senate primary run, he made violent video games a campaign issue, with the pro-Second Amendment candidate asserting the likes of Doom, Quake, and Postal were more dangerous than any tracer rounds or hollow points his militia buds were likely stockpiling. During a debate, he dismissed guns' role in violence, explaining that they were like tools, quote, like cars and 100 other things, end quote. Instead, he viewed violent video games as the real threat to public safety, explaining, quote, we have to face the reality that we are brainwashing kids at a very early age to be monsters, end quote. So we finally pivoted into video games.
So sorry, he's saying that guns are tools like cars and any other thing that you use to live your life? Okay.
Yes. I'm right at that Simpsons joke. He's like, it's a gun, it's not a weapon, it's a tool, like a harpoon or an alligator.
It's just so, I mean, we've talked before about how, previous people who've blamed video games or people who've acted violently, and they've said, oh, video games are the one things that link these various shooters. And we've pointed out, well, also guns are another thing that link these shooters. And it's just so fun. It's just highlights that hypocrisy even more, that it's someone who is in deep with militias is like, no, guns are not the problem. You see, it's fine when a bunch of people get together and stockpile guns.
Well, they need those guns to, be protected from the bad people with the guns.
Yeah, the dangerous thing is when one crazy person has the guns. It's like you said, it's fine for a bunch of people who think like me to have guns, but
well, how else are we going to have a good guy with a gun come take down the bad guy with the gun?
Good point.
Mm-hmm. That's just my big brain talking.
Yeah, we need to stop these like violent weirdos. Is what we need is a whole bunch of more violent weirdos, All right, so yeah, he starts focusing on video games, and like a bunch of other people we have covered in the show, I'm thinking in particular of Dave Grossman. Hold on to that name; we're going to go back to it in a second.
Wait, who? Who? Sorry, what?
Dave
what? Oh, yeah.
But yeah, like another person who is in this very pro-gun circle. In this case, a person who, again, supports guys some of which are very keen on the idea that the government needs to be violently overthrown for various reasons. And so a year later, after this thing, it says in 2000 in that debate, on April the 19th, 2001, in between his numerous repudiations from Nebraska voters, the conspiracy-pilled, disgraced former politician and defender of right-wing extremists set his sights on the video game menace. Bringing things back to where we started, when we started this series, he filed a massive $5 billion lawsuit on behalf of the family of William Dave Sanders. And we'll go back to Sanders in a minute. I'll talk a little bit more about him. But Sanders was a teacher who was killed in the April 20th, 1999 mass shooting at Columbine High School near Littleton, Colorado, in which 18-year-old Eric Harris and 17-year-old Dylan Klebold killed Sanders and 12 students and injured 24 others in what was then the worst school shooting in U.S. history, a record Americans remained depressingly determined to break. DeCamp sued effectively every major company in the video game industry, including id Software, Acclaim, Activision, Apogee, Atari, Capcom, Eidos, Infogrames, GT Interactive Software, Interplay, Midway, Nintendo, Sega, and Squaresoft. He also sued 2 pornography websites and the companies behind the film The Basketball Diaries because of that one scene where Leonardo DiCaprio is in a dream sequence and he opens fire in his school. Interestingly, his April 19th filing came one day shy of the 2-year anniversary of the Columbine shooting, as well as the 6th anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing, which, given what I've learned about how conspiracy theories rotted this dude's brain, I can't imagine was an accident. Now, before we get into the details regarding this case, I want to offer some brief context regarding Columbine-related litigation. Because in the aftermath of the shooting, there were countless conversations. I mean, just again, for context, Columbine was a really, really big deal when talking about a number of big topics right now. The role of guns in America, the connection of, what causes school shootings, and was really a nexus point in the conversation over violent video games. I'd like to think of, again, my research is kind of like how we talk about violent video games before Columbine, and this how we talk about violent video games after Columbine. This is a pivot point. In particular, the idea that before Columbine, a lot of the conversation about violent video games is very abstract. It's a lot about concerns that exposure to violent video games is going to desensitize people, and it may lead to violent actions somewhere down the line. With Columbine, the big change happens is now we're saying they cause school shootings and they cause mass shootings. And there are a couple of other earlier events that we could build to, but this is kind of the main nexus point of the idea violent video games cause mass shootings really comes from Columbine. And that really sets the conversation, I would argue, even to the present day. But anyway, Columbine was this massive event, and there were a number of different lawsuits that came out of Columbine. There were countless conversations, for example, over who was responsible, and more importantly, who would face consequences. With the shooters dead, there was no chance that they would, and as a result, there were tons of legal battles against a variety of other targets, including the Harris and Klebold families, Columbine High School administrators, and the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. And speaking of Jeffco, who were the main jurisdiction during the case, as an aside, there was plenty to be said about how poorly they handled this whole case, which we're not going to get into here. But suffice to say, families of the victims filed numerous legal complaints against the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, both of their handling of the shooting and to push the office to make information related to the case open to the public, because there were constant pleas from the parents, make the information public, and they dragged their feet a lot. Eventually, the numerous suits against the sheriff's office were brought together before federal judge Louis Babcock of the U.S. District Court for the District of Colorado, who dismissed all but one of them on November 27, 2001. The one that stood had been filed by the family of William Sanders. He went by Dave Sanders, the aforementioned teacher who died in the shooting. Now, while helping people escape, Sanders had been shot in the torso, head, and neck. Students managed to stabilize him in a classroom where they held out for help, calling 911 numerous times, and despite constant reassurances from dispatchers that help was on the way, it never came, and Sanders held out for 3 hours before succumbing to his injuries. In upholding this case against the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, Judge Babcock concluded the Jeffco Sheriff's Office handling of Sanders was so bad, it, quote, demonstrated a deliberate indifference toward Dave Sanders' plight, shocking to the conscience of this federal court, end quote. And a year later, the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office reached a $1.5 million settlement with Dave's daughter, Angela Sanders. So it's a little bit of context for the family of the person who's filing the suit. And the video game lawsuit was also not DeCamp's only Columbine-related litigation. On October 19, 2001, Columbine survivor Mark Taylor, who had been shot numerous times in the shooting, sued Solvay Pharmaceuticals, makers of the antidepressant Luvox, asserting the medication played a role in Eric Harris's behavior as he had been prescribed Luvox at the time of the massacre. DeCamp represented Taylor until Taylor fired him for pressuring him to settle, only to later settle for $10,000 in 2003. I can't help but think that maybe John DeCamp was trying to, pass him some literature. He's like, okay, we're going to figure out this brief. And what's this that fell out of my briefcase? Oh my, it's my book. Did I tell you I wrote a book? Would you like to know more? He's like stuffing it into his hand.
I will sign it for you.
Willing to autograph. Famous people have had my book. Don't ask how they got famous. All right. Back to DeCamp's video game lawsuit on behalf of Sanders' family. It's worth mentioning that leading up to his legal assault on the video game industry, he had started getting close with a persistent character on our show, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. Does anyone want to remind listeners about Dave?
This guy sucks. He pretends to be a psychologist. He pretended that his kids were at a school that had a school shooting. He pretended that he was personally very important in helping survivors of a school shooting. And he blames video games for a lot of the same stuff that other people do, and instead of blaming guns.
The resignation in your voice, Andy. Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. We affected a whole 14-part series on why we think Dave Grossman sucks and why Dave Grossman has become such an influential figure in the conversation over violent video games. But I'll spare you the details because, again, we devoted a whole series on the self-proclaimed killologist. But I will reiterate my thesis statement from that series, which goes as follows. Dave Grossman is a dangerous grifter who has spent the last 3 decades demonizing video games for causing violent behavior while also helping escalate America's ongoing crisis over guns and encouraging America's police to revel in causing violent death and suffering and making himself a shit ton of money in the process. So yeah, he's not great. And here he is again, rearing his head to another strange person connected to video games, particularly to the violent video game conversation. In his announcement, DeCamp cited Grossman's rhetoric about operant conditioning and the military's alleged doom-fueled murder simulator programs, declaring, quote, absent the combination of extremely violent video games and these boys' incredibly deep involvement, use of, and addiction to these games and the boys' basic personalities, these murders and this massacre would not have occurred, end quote. Later adding games like Doom turned Eric and Dylan into, quote, monster killers, end quote. He also declared that the self-proclaimed killologist was going to be an expert witness, and I use huge air quotes on expert, in the upcoming trial. So Dave is all over this lawsuit against the games industry.
Man. Thinking about Dave Grossman again, it just makes me wonder. So you know how he had that, his claim about, like, was it World War One? Soldiers were reluctant to shoot because they were found with their guns loaded, or whatever his malarkey was, or maybe it was Civil War. I don't know.
It was Civil War.
Civil War just made me think about how in video games, when you kill an enemy, you can then loot their body to get ammunition. Is that a sign that NPCs in video games are programmed to be afraid of killing? Makes you think, huh?
You cracked it right there. See, that's why you're able to succeed in Doom, because they're holding back. They have a natural aversion to killing, unlike the player. So yeah, an alliance between Dave and John made sense. They certainly had a lot in common. They were both ex-Army. And I will point out one thing is, like, they also have really high opinions of themselves in the military, because the thing that Dave likes to say is how he's this big adventurer. He's been in all sorts of, like, he's trained as an Army Ranger and a paratrooper, even though he basically mostly only served domestically. John DeCamp claimed he was a Green Beret. I have found no evidence to back this up, but in his book, he claimed he was a Green Beret. But anyway, so yeah, they're both ex-Army. They both have pretty close connections to religious and political extremism. And again, check out our series on Grossman for more on his. And they both appeared to be violent and resistant to facts that contradicted their worldviews. They were also both close buddies of right-wing conspiracy mongers Lyndon and Helga Zepp-LaRouche, with Dave as a frequent speaker at Helga's Schiller Institute. I would not be shocked if, for example, that they may be connected at a Schiller Institute thing. Totally speculating on that, but because they have a mutual in Lyndon and Helga Zepp-LaRouche. And also, as we covered in the past, the self-proclaimed killologist certainly has a track record of working with reactionary, attention-seeking weirdos interested in suing the video game industry. And if you need proof, I refer back to our old buddy, Mr. Jack Thompson. A man, I will remind you all, once offered a $10,000 charitable donation if someone made a video game where all of his personal enemies were brutally murdered, refused to make the donation when someone took him up on it, then called the police on the makers of Penny Arcade when they made the donation in his name. And for all that and more, check out our series on Jack Thompson. As an aside, I've got more Jack Thompson stories in the pipeline.
Oh, man. All of these guys are like if you step in some dog poop out on the sidewalk and you think you've wiped it off, and like 2 days later, you're still smelling it on your shoe. It's like we can't get rid of these guys. Ugh.
Oh yeah, that all being said, with this relationship they have now, I would love to be a fly on the wall for a lunch conversation between Dave Grossman and John DeCamp if they ever talked about Timothy McVeigh. As we covered in our series on Grossman, Dave, among his other alleged accolades, claims he turned down a $150 an hour gig as an expert witness in McVeigh's defense, only to turn and work for the prosecution. Meanwhile, DeCamp was pretty convinced that McVeigh was a government patsy who could have never blown up a federal building by himself without help from the feds, so I'd be interested to learn whose bullshit won out when the two got together.
Maybe they just agreed not to talk about it, or they're both equally so incurious that they didn't bother like checking up and learning about the other's association with it.
It was either strictly professional or about sports. How about them Huskers? Ooh-ah. It may also not shock you that DeCamp also claimed that he was sitting on a mountain of evidence that would blow the Columbine case wide open, none of which he could divulge because of pending litigation and fear of government retaliation. Gosh, it's funny how this keeps happening. For example, following the trial, in 2004, he put out yet another edition of the Franklin cover-up. So this is the third edition of this book. You know, most people write multiple books. Dave Grossman wrote multiple books. John DeCamp writes the same book over and over again. he put out another edition of the Franklin cover-up where he declared, quote, "One of these days, soon, when I get a legal comfort level to do so without getting punished by the legal system, I intend to blow it all straight on the real Columbine truths." That last part is in all caps. Skipping ahead, he never did, much to the chagrin of some of his supporters, which we'll cover in a few minutes. So what about John and Dave's case against these nasty peddlers of murder simulators? Let's skip ahead a little, less than a year after the filing. And on March the 4th, 2002, the U.S. District Court for the District of Colorado threw out DeCamp's case, leaving me to wonder, why didn't he use all his secret information he totally definitely had? What a long game he's playing.
It's 8D chess, you know?
It's you know what it is? It's that thing from Avengers Infinity War where he ran the scenarios in his head, and it's like, I've run through 3,405,6,802 times. How many do we ban video games? 1. And this is the start of it. This is the small domino to knock down the bigger dominoes. But yeah, in his dismissal, Judge Louis Babcock, the same guy who was in that case I mentioned a few minutes ago, ruled that there was no way for video game manufacturers to know that Columbine shooters Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, having consumed their products, would go on to commit mass murder, and creators of media, violent or otherwise, cannot be held responsible in the Columbine shooting any more than a gas station cannot be held responsible if someone uses gas purchased at said station to light someone on fire. As he explained, quote, "In the circumstances alleged here, the video game and movie defendants had no reason to suppose that Harris and Klebold would decide to murder or injure their fellow classmates and teachers. Plaintiffs do not allege that these defendants had any knowledge of Harris and Klebold's identities, let alone their violent proclivities. Nor, for that matter, did the video game and movie defendants have any reason to believe that a shooting spree was a likely or probable consequence of exposure to their movie or video games. At most, based on plaintiffs' allegations that children who witness acts of violence and or who interactively involved with creating violence or violent images often act more violently themselves and sometimes recreate the violence, these defendants might have speculated that their motion picture or video games had the potential to stimulate an idiosyncratic reaction in the mind of some disturbed individuals. A speculative possibility, however, is not enough to create a legal duty," end quote. On top of that, Babcock ruled that making media creators like game companies consider every possible individual reaction to their media, violent or otherwise, put those creators in a position where they would be inclined to not create media at all for fear of legal retaliation. This is a state of affairs in free speech known as a chilling effect, thus limiting their right to free speech, saying, quote, "The defendant cannot be faulted, obviously, for putting its game on the market without attempting to ascertain the mental condition of each and every prospective player. The only practicable way of ensuring that the game would never reach a mentally fragile individual would be to refrain from selling it at all, because plaintiff's legal theory would effectively compel defendants not to market their works and thus refrain from expressing the ideas contained in those works. The burden imposed would be immense and the consequences dire for free and open society," end quote. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, yeah, I think that judge put it quite well. I feel like if I were that judge, and this is one of the reasons, despite my own professed legal expertise, one of the reasons I'll never be a judge is that I would be a so-called activist judge. I feel like I also would have thrown in, you know who maybe should have expected that their products would be used for violent purposes? The sellers of the guns and bullets used in this. And if you want to sue somebody, sue them.
So yeah, this is where this takes an interesting turn. And in Judge Babcock reaching this ruling, the video game industry has an unlikely hero to thank for this important precedent-building case. Mr. Jack Thompson.
Dun, dun, dun.
What a twist, huh? That's right, Jack Thompson scored a surprising victory for the games industry. And it all goes back to his $130 million wrongful death lawsuit he filed against game makers, where he alleged that playing too many video games turned Michael Carneal, the perpetrator of the December 1st, 1997 Heath High School shooting, into a John Wick-level super marksman. If you want more details on that, check out our series on Dave Grossman, because we talked about this case. Thompson filed that suit on April the 9th, 1999, 11 days before the Columbine shooting, and he has never ceased to remind people that he had the otherworldly clairvoyance to successfully predict a mass shooting would happen in America. Who could have predicted that? In it, he sued effectively every major player in the video game industry, including id Software, Acclaim, Activision, Apogee, Atari, Capcom, Eidos, Infogrames, GT Interactive Software, Interplay, Midway, Nintendo, Sega, and Squaresoft, as well as 2 pornography websites and the makers and distributors of the film The Basketball Diaries. And if any of those details sound familiar, hold on to that. On April the 6th, 2000, a little more than a year before DeCamp filed his wrongful death lawsuit, Judge Edward Huggins Johnstone of the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Kentucky dismissed Thompson's case, asserting, among other things, that there was no way for video game manufacturers to know that Carneal, having consumed their products, would go on a shooting spree, and that making media creators like game companies consider every possible individual reaction to their media, violent or otherwise, would put those creators in a position where they would be inclined not to create media at all for fear of legal retaliation, a state of affairs in free speech known as a chilling effect, thus limiting their right to free speech. According to Johnstone, quote, reasonable people would not conclude that it was foreseeable to defendants that Michael Carneal, a boy who played their games, watched their movie, and viewed their website materials, would murder his classmates. Even accepting the pleaded facts as true, that Michael Carneal was an avid consumer of violent video games, nihilistic movies, and obscene internet materials and was influenced by all of these events, does not make the murders foreseeable to the defendants. The facts in this case also present a situation where the manufacturers and distributors would likewise be charged with attempting to ascertain the mental condition of consumers before marketing their materials, end quote. And I feel like I just got deja vu. So what do we all think about that?
Hey, so was Babcock deliberately, was he citing Johnstone's opinion when he issued his own?
Maybe a little bit. Just a little bit. So yeah, as it turns out, in addition to a failed politician, conspiracy monger, and friend of both right-wing terrorists and Dave Grossman, we could potentially add another title to John DeCamp's illustrious resume. Plagiarist. At the time of its filing, few people failed to observe that DeCamp's wrongful death suit was basically Jack Thompson's wrongful death suit, with some of the names changed. And even Judge Babcock himself described the 2 suits in his ruling as presenting, quote, virtually identical claims, end quote. It certainly made Judge Babcock's job easier because he was able to cite the ruling in Thompson's case a year earlier as part of a growing body of precedent that eventually led to video games receiving free speech protection under U.S. law. And for more on that, check out our Brown v. EMA episode. So yeah, exactly what you said, Andy. He cites large sections of the initial Michael Carneal ruling because basically both of the lawsuits were exactly the same.
Yeah, and it's so funny that, back then, DeCamp cribbing off of Thompson's lawsuit was something that maybe he would be ashamed of being caught doing. Nowadays, special interest groups will just deliberately go to receptive states and be like, oh, pass this legislation. We will give you the exact text. We also gave it to Florida. We also gave it to Texas. They're just very open and upfront about the idea that they're reusing the text.
Yeah, it's like a form suit because Thompson goes back to this, he sues numerous times in his, illustrious career. And I have found the rulings on some of them. I can't always find what his initial filings, and I wish I could. If people could find that, scandalschemespodcast@gmail.com, just because I would love to read Jack's legal briefs. I've read a couple of them. They're entertaining. But yeah, this whole idea that it's almost like he's like, okay, with this particular suit, it's like, it didn't work here, we'll just do it here. But that's not how the law works, because every time you lose a case, that is now precedent. And so Jack's suit became precedent for this suit, and the ruling in this suit then becomes precedent for additional suits. So it makes it harder for wrongful death suits like this to work because they're building up this whole thing about that we need to weigh the free speech rights of the people creating that. There's no way that they can foresee all of the mental states of everyone who are consuming their products, And so again, Jack plays a really weird role in getting video games free speech protection that he kind of inadvertently, again, I talked about the one little domino setting this in motion. Jack kind of did that. And all of this leads me to follow John DeCamp's lead and entertain some conspiracy-minded thinking of my own. Was Jack Thompson a secret pro-video game sleeper agent sent by game makers to make the most incompetent attempts at suing the games industry to build a body of cases that would eventually get them full free speech protection?
Please see my earlier screed about not believing in conspiracy theories. So no, I do not think that Jack Thompson is a victim of a video game mind control experiment that gave him dissociative identity disorder.
He played too much Lemmings, and it just
There is a lot of loss of life in Lemmings if you play it wrong.
there is.
Or right for that matter. It takes a while.
Let's think of a funny one, because I want to think of a fun one. Maybe he just played too much Zumbinis, and he's like, I need to sue the games industry. I need to save the games industry. Wait, what am I doing? Wait, I'm just asking questions here. All right. In any case, the next time you play, Doom or Helldivers or, Assassin's Creed Shadows or whatever, make sure you thank Jack for making all that possible. I'm sure he'll love that. Going back to DeCamp, having failed to stop those nasty, violent video games, John returned to his two passions: failed election campaigns and conspiracy mongering. In 2006, he tried running for the Nebraska legislature again, although he quickly got into trouble for making racially insensitive remarks against longtime Senator Ernie Chambers. Incidentally, Ernie Chambers was also the same person who initially opened the investigation into alleged sexual abuse in the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union back in 1988. When asked for comment, Chambers gave, in my opinion, an amazing takedown of DeCamp, explaining to a reporter in April 2006, quote, "People are entitled to send a mule skinner down here to Lincoln if they choose. If the people in the district DeCamp is running it wants to send a braying jackass, they're entitled to do it," end quote.
Shots fired.
John is like, anyway, I have high hopes for this election. I will see you in Lincoln. Yeah, it didn't work out for John on this one either. He also kept banging the drum for the alleged Franklin cover-up and spent the next several years talking with conspiracy-minded content creators. For example, he made several appearances on the Alex Jones show.
Oh, God. Please tell me you don't have a 30-part miniseries about Alex Jones planned.
I will leave, Kevin. I will leave.
I don't need to, because there's already the podcast Knowledge Fight, which has been doing that for like a decade now.
Okay, and we salute their sacrifice.
Seriously, the basic thing they come to is, Alex Jones is a grifter, ultimately,
And as we said earlier, being stupid and being a grifter are not mutually exclusive.
They're not. Alex Jones is living proof. John also used his law firm's website primarily to hawk his book. With that, let's skip ahead to roughly the end of our tale. John DeCamp died on July the 27th, 2017 at the Norfolk Veterans Home in Norfolk, Nebraska at the age of 76. Normies will tell you his demise was likely due to several long-term health issues, including battles with Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's, along with complications attributed to a 2011 car accident. However, those truly plugged in know. What clearly happened was that the deep state finally got around to icing him for all the dirt he'd been sitting on for decades, luring him into a false sense of security after all those years of lining up their pieces and finding just the right moment to strike.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, if he indeed did have any of that evidence that he claimed to, one would imagine that, like, being terminal, or more or less being terminal, would be like, all right, what do I have to lose? Sure, ice me if you want. Let me release all this. But I guess the conspiracy theorists would say, well, you see, by this point, his Alzheimer's, he just no longer remembered where that evidence was hidden. And so it's still out there. We just need to keep looking.
Do they have family?
Yeah, he had family.
That's the other card that could get played. Oh, they're going to go after my family.
See, I assume the Illuminati just hit him with their secret Alzheimer's gun, which they definitely have. And
Was that from Saints Row 3?
no, that's the dubstep gun. That's slightly more fun. It's, I'd say, significantly more fun.
Just slightly more fun, yes.
No, my favorite of those kinds of weapons in video games is, Andy, have you ever played Resistance 3?
No, I have not.
It's part of the Resistance series, which was a bunch of PS3 exclusive shooters. Resistance 3 has this gun called the Mutator. So the whole thing about the gun is if you hit it at an enemy, it causes the enemy to violently throw up. And there is a secondary function where you can charge it up and make a bunch of enemies near each other just start throwing up. It is very, very funny.
Nice.
As a person with chronic stomach issues, that's not, I mean, I get the humor, but I wouldn't have fun doing that or watching it.
So yeah, DeCamp passes. His passing was eulogized both in mainstream news circles and the wild fringes of the internet. The Omaha World Herald and Omaha's ABC affiliate KETV each put out articles after his death, remembering him as an influential and largely respected local lawmaker. Meanwhile, his memory is significantly more divided in conspiracy circles. For example, I came across a report on his death from a YouTuber and blogger who went by the name free-range humans, who praised him as a personally decent guy. This guy apparently knew him personally. However, that didn't stop humans from taking DeCamp to task for not publishing the volumes of evidence he super pingy promised he had been sitting on for the various conspiracies he mongered, leading humans to speculate whether John DeCamp was an FBI plant the whole time.
That was another reason my professor said not to believe in conspiracy theories, is that anything that you say to disprove it, they can just add another layer to the conspiracy. Like, well, you see, they're covering that up too. So, or this person all along must have been a mole to get us to reveal our secrets to him. And
so yeah, there are people in the conspiracy who now begin to start thinking that he was a plant, that he was just like someone that the FBI was trying to use to lure in these people. As an aside, if you want to get a better sense of how free-range humans sees the world, here's a selection of tags added to the post on John DeCamp's death. Censorship, CIA, disinformation, fascism, Franklin, mind control, MK Ultra, New World Order, pedophilia, propaganda, Satanism, Talmudic Jews, and the Zionist Rothschild agenda. Yeah, he's one of them. Meanwhile, perusing the comments section as well as other spots on the internet, such as reviews of the Internet Archive's digital copy of the 2005 edition of the Franklin cover-up, reveals a roughly even split between people who think he's a hero and those who think he was secretly working for the feds the whole time. For example, there's another one of these wild conspiracy books called Programmed to Kill: The Politics of Serial Murder by this guy named David McGowan, who claims in his book that DeCamp was both an FBI stooge and working on a secret FBI project to psychologically condition soldiers in Vietnam to commit atrocities. So this conspiracy dude has become a character in other conspiracies.
Snake eating its own tail.
Imagine if these people had TikTok, this would be like a 3,000-part series.
Mm. I mean, it's probably on TikTok now. I don't.
No, yeah, but I mean, people who are, you go on TikTok and see people who are like, think they're in the midst of something going on regarding a conspiracy.
I haven't. I dare not to.
It's chilling. I don't seek this out. It's just every so often I get into a weird side of TikTok and it's chilling.
Yeah, it's scary what that does. There are real harms to that. Again, if I recommend another podcast on a similar topic, there's the podcast, the QAA podcast. It used to go by the QAnon Anonymous podcast, which talks about a lot of different types of internet conspiracies. And one of the things they talk about sometimes is, the people whose lives are destroyed by being part of these things.
Yeah, and when people do get out of, those who are fortunate enough to get out of this headspace and get out of these situations, like afterwards look back on evidence of what they were saying and thinking, like it can be really scary. You almost don't recognize yourself sometimes,
Yeah, your heart goes out to people when they realize that moment when they realize that this is what they've been doing. But the whole thing about DeCamp, that like people are in conspiracy circles are beginning to think that he is a plant. Because truly in the pilled community, you either die a hero under alleged mysterious circumstances, or you live long enough to be called an op. Now, DeCamp may be gone, but his conspiracies live on as his most enduring legacy. And as the years went on, his tales of satanic pedophile cults fueled by Omaha credit union money unsurprisingly took hold in conspiracy-minded circles of the internet, getting folded into other related conspiracies such as Pizzagate and QAnon. Like, you still see Franklin cover-up conspiracy theorists on the internet. It's just like, it's exploded online. For example, in a December 29th, 2010 Twitter post, professionally incurious person Joe Rogan promoted Conspiracy of Silence, the 1993 documentary based on DeCamp's book that had allegedly been suppressed by the Discovery Channel. While perusing LexisNexis, I found a Christian Newswire transcript from a religious radio show from March the 29th, 2014 that mentioned DeCamp's book while accusing John Benet Ramsey's dad of being a secret Satanist and declaring the Columbine shooting proves that Prozac turns kids into murderers. In 2015, the last podcast on the left did a whole series on the Franklin scandal. However, they uncritically reported as fact the claims DeCamp made in his book. I listened to this when I was starting to research DeCamp. They basically just quote from DeCamp's book, The Franklin Cover-Up, and don't seem to really critically examine his claims in any meaningful way. As late as July the 20th, 2022, the UK tabloid and creators of the Murder by PlayStation headline, The Daily Mail, and if you want more on that, check out our Manhunt series, published an article promoting the scandal as fact, where in an article titled, Evil in the Heart of America, the Mail spared readers no details of the lurid sexual abuse involving children that is accused in the books, because that's how you warn people of the dangerous effects of media, is by subjecting your readers to just the most gross shit you can. And to wrap things up is If you come across tales of the deep state, Pizzagate, lizard people, or satanic child abuse, there you will find the disgraced, red-pilled, militia-connected lawyer who sued the video game industry over Columbine. And with that, I say, final thoughts.
I don't know. I hope his family is not as deep in the weeds of all this stuff as he was, and also that any conspiracy believers are not too annoying and or dangerous to any survivors that he has, because as we've seen, people who are deep in conspiracy theories do dangerous things sometimes when they confront someone who they believe to be hiding a conspiracy. Otherwise, if you find that the things you're saying are alienating everyone who has ever loved you in your life, maybe you need to think about what you're saying, and as opposed to thinking the problem is with everybody else.
Yeah, Kevin, what do you see as the lasting impact of DeCamp's work, such as it is?
That's a good question. I see, going back to Knowledge Fight, I started listening to it a bunch. And like, for example, one consistent message that Alex Jones has is that basically that the Democrats and people connected to them are basically satanic vampires who prey on children's blood, or who are basically demons who are, preying on the life force of everyone around them. Like you see that. I see what John DeCamp was putting in the Franklin cover-up in 1992. And I just see elements, I see like this resonance of, you see reverberations, that is, you see reverberations of the kinds of things that John DeCamp is saying. Now, he didn't originate these kinds of things, those kinds of, blood sacrifice conspiracies, or particularly when they involve, child abuse rings. Those kinds of conspiracies predate him too. But I do see him as kind of a signpost in this kind of history. And I see like elements of like, again, what Alex Jones talks about, and like QAnon conspiracies are often tied into things like this too, that I see elements of that part of it. And a conspiracy like this is extremely dangerous for a number of different reasons, not just the impact that it does to the people who believe that, how it alienates them, isolates them from, people who care about them and push them into these more like cult mentalities, but also the targets of the people who are allegedly perpetrating these are consistently people that these groups who are perpetuating these things want to demonize, want to hate. And often I see it like in the case of like the American political scene right now, emphasizing that Democrats are doing that. And I'm not saying that Donald Trump is advocating for that, but there are definitely people who follow Donald Trump who think those kinds of things, that people are literally evil, that they're literally evil beings. There are monsters who are preying on our innocence and the most harsh crime that you can commit, against the innocence of children. And therefore, if they are monsters, if they are literally inhuman people who prey on them, then I am, if I believe in these things, then I am obligated to do something about it. And you could see a person going from that starting point to, like, for example, committing real acts of violence. And the other thing I'll notice about that too, there's that part of it, but also like I noticed in the Satanic Panic that Satanism became a really easy go-to for particularly, I'm going to say particularly conservatives, particularly evangelical conservative groups that kind of push for this idea. It became a really easy way for them to lash out against values that aren't theirs. What they could identify as aberrant behavior. My child is acting out. Or maybe my child is being groomed, that like this is an easy way to demonize, any kind of marginalized groups, gay people, trans people, that it becomes an easy way to stand in, well, they are inhuman monsters preying on children. And that's the thing I see linked to today, that there are these groups who like demonize particularly marginalized groups who are, or people who aren't having that kind of influence on things. And people will then see this as a way of kind of a green light that I need to do something, and will lead to violent acts. I see a link between these kinds of ideas and people doing real harm. That's where I see the link to, and again, just so much of the of internet discourse right now is like poisoned by these kinds of discourses that people are seen as literally evil. So that's where I see the resonance of this today. Now, it's not all John DeCamp doing this, but he is a contributor to this thing. And like I said, there are people online who link the Franklin conspiracy with later ones like Pizzagate, like QAnon. So that's where I see it.
So he was if I can paraphrase, he was laying some foundational groundwork for these later conspiracies.
I would say that.
They can say, hey, historically this was happening, and it was a cover up previously, and it's a cover up now.
Yeah, I see him as a precursor to the online conspiracy circles of today.
I see. Yeah.
So yeah, if the conspiracies and the actions taken by their believers today are considered those partway ascending Everest, maybe we could call him base DeCamp.
Yeah, that's kind of a downer to end on. I'm gonna think of the happier parts of this. The fact that, John DeCamp joked that he couldn't spell militia. His book is wild. If you come into it with the right headspace, it is entertainingly insane.
Wasn't there the thing that Dan Quayle couldn't spell potato and everyone lost their minds?
Yes.
I thought it was potatoes that.
Oh.
No.
Yeah.
I think you're right. It's potato that he
Yeah.
put an E at the end of potato singular. Yeah.
What a quaint time when that was a disqualifying thing for a candidate. But yeah, I get all of this started because I was researching Columbine and I came across the lawsuit and I saw this name, John DeCamp. I'd never heard of him. And that's what led me down this path. Because then I found his book, The Franklin Cover Up. I was like, there's no way this could be the same guy. And it is. And who thought, like, looking at one name, came across this whole wild story, and it's like I'm not saying I'm blazing new trails or anything, but I haven't seen anybody talk about him in this context. So I guess you try to be the research that you want to be in the world. I don't know what else to say about that, but this is what I love about doing this show, is just pulling that one thread and just seeing where it goes, and this is where it ended up. All right. And that will do it for today's episode of Scandalous Games. If you like what we're doing and want to help the show, subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. If you want to learn more, check out our website, scandalousgamespodcast.wordpress.com, where I publish the show notes and the sources for every episode. Our theme music is Occam Seek by Seek Knowledge via the Free Music Archive. User under is CC BY-NC-SA 3.0 US license. If you have a question, comment, or idea for a topic for a future episode, email us at scandalousgamespodcast@gmail.com. And until next time, I'm Kevin Impellizeri.
I'm Andy Hunter.
I'm Kate.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next Scandal. Subscribe to Fat Roll Gaming on YouTube and listen to So We Were Talking About Beast Wars wherever you get your podcast.